He was called worthless, a dog nobody wanted. Luke, a Marine veteran, saw something different, something that mirrored his own pain. Taking the shepherd home was only the beginning. Each night revealed old wounds, each day uncovered new scars. And when strangers came offering money and threats, Luke realized this was no ordinary rescue. This was a fight for truth. Join us as we follow a story of courage and second chances. If it moves you, hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which part struck you the most. The county fairgrounds looked tired that evening, as if even the wooden beams overhead carried the weight of too many forgotten stories. A pair of yellow bulbs flickered against the high rafters, throwing uncertain light over rows of folding chairs. The floor was swept clean but still smelled of manure and dust, a mixture familiar to anyone who had grown up in Ohio. People came not because they wanted to, but because they had nothing better to do. On the concrete platform in the middle of the room, a shepherd mix lay on its side, ribs showing through a coat that had once been proud but now was patchy and dull. His body bore the kind of scars that didn't happen by accident. Lines across his flanks, an old wound near his ear, raw patches where fur refused to grow. But what unsettled most was not his body. It was the stillness. He didn't flinch when the auctioneer tapped the microphone. He didn't turn his head when whispers rippled across the crowd. He lay as though the world had already ended for him. Starting bid at $50, the auctioneer tried, his voice carrying a forced cheerfulness that fell flat in the stale air. Silence followed, broken only by the squeak of a chair. Then came a voice from the back, sharp and careless. Not worth a dime. Laughter scattered across the rows. Another chimed in, damaged goods. The words stung, though they weren't aimed at Luke. They reminded him too much of words thrown around overseas, words used to describe men who couldn't keep up after too many missions, too many nights awake. He shifted in his chair, his hands clasped together so tightly that his knuckles whitened. Luke Miller was only 32, but the years had carved themselves deep into him. His face was clean-shaven but hard, his posture stiff from habit rather than pride. The Marine Corps jacket he wore had frayed cuffs and a patch sewn back on with clumsy stitches. He never wore it to show off. He wore it because some mornings he couldn't bring himself to wear anything else. Since returning home, life had slowed to a crawl. He spent mornings tending to his grandfather's land, evenings sitting alone on the porch with a mug gone cold. The nights stretched longest, haunted by memories he never invited but that always found him. He hadn't planned on being here. The auction notice had caught his eye in the classified section, 6 small lines tucked between farm equipment and used cars. Former guard dog. Aggressive. No training possible. Final sale before euthanasia. He remembered staring at the words until they blurred. Something in them pulled at a place inside him he didn't like to visit. Now he was here, and so was the dog, both of them out of place, both of them waiting for someone to decide what they were worth. The auctioneer cleared his throat. $50? Anybody? The laughter rose again, meaner this time, like a wave eager to drown what little dignity the animal had left. The dog's eyes opened, just a crack, revealing a dull yellow-brown. Luke caught it. In that fraction of a second, he saw something he had seen before. It wasn't rage or fear. It was emptiness. The kind that settled in after too many battles. The kind you couldn't fix with rest or medicine. He had seen it in the eyes of brothers who came back broken. He had seen it in the mirror on nights he didn't recognize himself. He couldn't look away. Without thinking, Luke pushed back his chair. The metal legs scraped against the concrete, the sound harsh enough to cut through the laughter. Heads turned. The auctioneer froze mid-sentence. Shadows from the hanging lights divided Luke's face, one half hidden, the other etched with resolve. "I'll take him," he said. Voice low but steady. The room fell silent. The laughter died as quickly as it had started. People stared, waiting for him to laugh it off, but he didn't. "One bid, $50. The auctioneer stammered, glancing around. "Sold." The gavel came down with a hollow thud, sealing a deal that felt heavier than paper and ink. Someone muttered from the back, "He's crazy." Another shook his head. "Waste of money." Luke ignored them. His focus was on the animal still lying on the cold floor, unmoving, as if the decision hadn't touched him at all. The auctioneer shoved a leash into Luke's hand. The leather was cracked and stiff, worn down from years of neglect. Luke crouched, boots scraping against the floor, his body angled not to intimidate but to meet the dog where he was. His voice softened, carrying that calm rhythm he once used when steadying young recruits before their first firefight. "Hey, buddy," he murmured. "You don't know me, and I don't know you. But we're walking out of here together." The dog's ears flicked, almost imperceptibly. A spark, trying to lighten a storm. Luke didn't push. He knew too well the weight of moving before you were ready. He stayed there, crouched in the dim light, ignoring the stares pressing on his back. A long minute passed. Maybe two. Doubt crept in, whispering that the others had been right. Maybe this animal was too far gone. Maybe he was nothing but a shadow of what he had been. Then, the dog exhaled. It was shaky, rough, but it filled the silence like a bell. It wasn't surrender. It was an acknowledgement, however small. Luke rose slowly, keeping the leash slack. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's get out of here." The dog didn't stand. Not yet. But Luke wasn't disappointed. He knew beginnings didn't always look like movement. Sometimes they looked like a breath. The first one after years of holding it in. As Luke walked toward the exit, he felt eyes following him, some amused, some pitying, none understanding. It didn't matter. For the first time in a long time, Luke felt the faintest pull of direction. Behind him, the shepherd shifted slightly, his gaze following. Neither of them knew it yet, but a door had opened that night, one that could not be shut again. Luke walked out of the auction house with the leash still slack in his hand, his boots dragging a faint trail of dirt on the gravel path. The evening air felt cooler than it had inside, sharp with the smell of rain coming from far off. The parking lot stretched out before him, dotted with trucks and dusty sedans, each vehicle carrying someone who had come to witness a bargain or a laugh. He reached his old pickup, the red paint dulled with years and weather, the bed filled with hay bales he had forgotten to unload earlier. He glanced down at the shepherd who had followed only as far as the doorway, then stopped, lowering his body like a statue. His paws were splayed wide against the concrete, claws gripping as though the earth itself were the only anchor he trusted. Luke crouched low again, resting his forearms on his knees, trying not to crowd him. "This is it, buddy," he said softly. "Truck's not much, but it'll get us home." The dog's eyes flicked toward him, then away, scanning the rows of vehicles like a soldier assessing escape routes. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, every muscle taut with suspicion. Luke knew better than to pull. Force wasn't the answer. He'd seen what happened to men pushed too hard, too fast. They either shut down completely or lashed out with the kind of rage that burned bridges before they were built. He set the leash down on the gravel, leaving it loose, and leaned back against the truck tire. The sun dipped lower, bleeding orange into purple across the Ohio sky. People filed past with boxes, crates, and the occasional goat tugging at a rope, throwing curious glances at Luke sitting there like he had nowhere else to be. He ignored them. Time passed in measured breaths. The shepherd didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, as if waiting for something or someone who would never come. Luke reached into his pocket and pulled out a granola bar, unwrapping it slowly. The crinkle of foil made the dog's ears twitch. He broke off a piece and set it on the ground between them, then leaned back, chewing the rest without looking down. For a long while the piece of granola sat untouched. Then, almost imperceptibly, the shepherd inched forward, one paw dragging, then another, his movements stiff, as though each step carried the weight of memory. He sniffed the crumb but didn't eat it, only pressed his nose against it before stepping back again. Luke didn't say anything. He had learned the power of silence, the way it could build trust more than words ever could. The light faded. The parking lot emptied until only a few trucks remained. A janitor locked the side door of the auction house, casting one last curious glance before disappearing. The world grew quieter, save for the buzz of insects and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. Luke's back ached from sitting on the gravel, but he stayed. He talked occasionally, not expecting an answer. He spoke about the farm, about the horses that would shy away at first but settle once they realized you meant no harm, about the creek that ran behind the barn where he used to fish with his grandfather. His voice was calm, low, steady. He wasn't trying to convince the dog. He was simply filling the night with something other than silence. Hours slipped by. The air cooled until his breath showed faint clouds. Luke shifted, pulling his jacket tighter, and noticed the shepherd had lowered himself to the ground, lying in the shadow of a nearby car. He wasn't close, but he hadn't run either. That was something. Luke checked his watch. Nearly 3 hours. He leaned his head back against the tire, eyes closing for a moment. Exhaustion pressed heavy, but he refused to give in. When he opened his eyes again, the lot was nearly empty. The last vehicle rumbled out, taillights shrinking into the distance. The dog was still there, watching him with eyes that caught the faint glow of the overhead lamp. They stayed like that, man and dog in quiet standoff, until the lamp flickered once and buzzed into silence, plunging the lot into near darkness. A wind stirred, carrying with it the faint smell of manure and gasoline. The shepherd rose slowly, stretching his stiff limbs, and began to walk. His steps were hesitant, each one pausing as though reconsidering, but they carried him toward Luke. Luke held still, resisting the urge to reach out. He let the dog close the distance, inch by inch, until he stopped just a few feet away. The leash lay on the gravel between them, coiled like a question. The shepherd didn't look at it. He looked past Luke, at the open bed of the truck, at the long road beyond. Then he exhaled, a sound that trembled in the air, and lowered his head. Luke's throat tightened. He didn't smile, didn't speak. He simply lifted the leash gently, looping it without resistance. The shepherd didn't fight, didn't flee. He stood, still trembling, but rooted to the spot as if realizing the night offered no other choice. Luke rose slowly, brushing dust from his jeans. He opened the passenger door, the hinges creaking, and stepped aside. "Your call," he murmured. For a long moment the dog didn't move. Then, with deliberate slowness, he placed one paw on the step, paused, then another. He didn't leap in. He crawled, cautious, finally curling against the worn seat as though bracing for impact. Luke shut the door softly, the sound echoing too loud in the empty lot. He started the truck, the engine coughing before settling into a low rumble. The shepherd stiffened at the noise, ears flat, but didn't bolt. Luke kept his eyes on the road ahead, giving the animal space to decide if he would stay. The truck rolled forward into the darkness, headlights cutting through the night. The shepherd shifted once, curling tighter, his body pressed against the door. He wasn't trusting. Not yet. But he wasn't running either. And for Luke, that was enough to keep driving. The gravel road to Luke's ranch stretched long and lonely under the headlights, cutting through empty fields and tree lines that whispered against the night. By the time he pulled into the driveway, the shepherd was still curled against the passenger door, rigid but quiet, eyes wide as though memorizing every turn of the wheels. The old farmhouse loomed at the end of the lane, its porch light glowing faintly against the darkness. Luke parked near the barn, killed the engine, and sat for a moment, listening to the crickets fill the silence. He glanced at the dog. "We're home," he said, though the word felt strange in his mouth. Slowly he opened the door, stepping into the cool night. The dog hesitated, then slid carefully out of the truck, paws landing on gravel as if testing for traps. Luke didn't try to guide him. He simply walked toward the barn, leaving the door ajar, and waited. The shepherd followed at a distance, his shadow stretching long in the moonlight. Inside the barn, the smell of hay and wood lingered, familiar and grounding for Luke. He had spread fresh straw in one corner, set out a water bucket, and placed an old blanket near it. The space was modest, but it was safe. He pointed toward it gently. "That's yours tonight," he said. The dog's ears flicked back, his body low, eyes scanning every corner. Luke backed away, leaving him the space. He climbed the steps to the porch, where the boards creaked beneath his weight, and sank into a chair, watching through the open barn doors. The shepherd didn't settle. He paced along the walls, sniffing the ground, pausing at the corners. At last he lay down near the door, not inside, not out, as though uncertain whether the space belonged to him. Luke stayed awake longer than he intended, listening to the night deepen. When his eyes grew heavy, he rose, locked the barn carefully, and stepped inside the house. Hours later, near midnight, the ranch groaned under the shift of cooling beams and the whisper of wind against the shutters. Luke stirred awake in his bedroom, his chest tight with the kind of dreams that came without warning. He rubbed his eyes, sat on the edge of the bed, and listened. A sudden sound split the quiet, sharp and metallic, the slam of a loose barn door against its frame. From the yard came a low, guttural growl, followed by frantic, scrabbling claws. Luke rushed to the window. In the faint light, he saw the shepherd throwing himself against the barn door, body rigid, eyes wild with terror. Each slam of the wood against its hinges sent him into another frenzy, his paws clawing at the frame, teeth flashing in desperation. Luke grabbed a flashlight and hurried outside, his boots crunching gravel. The moment the beam cut through the dark, the dog whipped around, crouching low, ears flat. His body trembled so violently it looked as if he might shatter. Luke froze a few feet away, lowering the flashlight so it wouldn't blind him. "Easy," he said. Voice firm, but soft. "It's just the door. Just the wind." The shepherd didn't calm. His breathing came in harsh pants, saliva dripping from his jaws, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Luke recognized the look. He had seen it before on men waking from firefights in the desert, convinced they were still under attack. He felt the memory rise like bile, the flash of mortar rounds in the dark, the pounding in his ears, the weight of being trapped. His own body stiffened before he forced himself to breathe, to ground. He crouched low, steadying his voice though his throat burned. "I know," he whispered. "I know what that sound feels like. I've been there." The dog pressed himself against the wall, cornered, shaking uncontrollably. Luke set the flashlight on the ground, letting it spill sideways across the gravel. He sat down slowly, his back against a fence post, keeping his movements deliberate. He didn't reach for the leash. He didn't close the distance. He simply talked, letting the words fill the cold air. "I remember doors too. I remember waking up to them slamming shut and thinking it meant the end. I know what it's like to be locked in a place you can't escape, waiting for something you can't stop." His chest tightened, memories pressing heavy, but he pushed through them. "You're safe here. No cages, no locks. Just night sounds and wind." The shepherd's panting slowed, not calm but less frantic. His eyes fixed on Luke, as if testing the truth of his words. The seconds stretched, punctuated only by the rattle of the door in the wind. Luke stayed still. He thought of his own nights after deployment, the way every slam, every sudden sound sent him gasping back into firefights. He remembered the hollow-eyed stares in hospital corridors, the men who flinched at the squeak of hinges, and now he saw it in the dog, mirrored and raw. After long minutes, the shepherd's body eased fractionally. He lowered his head to the ground, though his muscles stayed taut, ears flicking at every creak. Luke let the silence speak for them both, his own breath misting in the cold air. He stayed until the wind died, until the barn door stopped rattling. Only then did the shepherd close his eyes, not in rest but in exhausted surrender, paws curled tight beneath him. Luke pushed himself to his feet, joints aching, and retrieved the flashlight. He latched the barn door carefully, making sure it would not slam again. As he turned, he glanced back at the dog lying in the straw near the entrance, eyes half open, body still alert. Luke whispered, "We'll figure it out." More to himself than to the animal. He walked back toward the porch, the boards creaking beneath his boots, leaving the night behind, but carrying its echoes in his chest. The morning broke quiet over the ranch, light spilling across the fields, painting the barns in soft gold. Luke had barely slept, the memory of the dog's panic from the night before still gnawing at him. He sipped his coffee on the porch, his eyes fixed on the shepherd lying near the fence line. The animal hadn't touched his food, hadn't moved except to shift his body slightly against the morning chill. Luke sighed, pulled out his phone, and made the call he'd been avoiding. By mid-morning, a truck appeared at the edge of the gravel drive, dust trailing behind it. Emma Collins stepped out, a woman in her mid-30s with calm eyes that carried years of quiet resilience. She was the local veterinarian, someone Luke's grandfather had trusted, though Luke himself had rarely seen her since coming back home. She greeted him, with a steady voice. You said it's a shepherd? Military background? Luke nodded, his arms crossed, gaze slipping toward the animal. He's been through something. Won't let me near him half the time. Last night, the sound of the barn door nearly broke him. Emma gave a small nod, the kind that didn't judge but understood. She walked toward the truck bed, retrieving her worn leather bag, its surface scratched from years of use. The moment the zipper whispered open, the shepherd's head shot up, his ears pinned back, a low growl rising from his chest. Emma froze mid-motion, her fingers still on the handle. The growl deepened, vibrating in the air like a warning neither of them could ignore. Luke stiffened. He doesn't like strangers, he said quietly, but Emma shook her head without looking away from the dog. That's not it. Slowly, she let the bag close, easing her hands away. The shepherd's eyes stayed locked on it, his body trembling, muscles coiled as though ready to defend himself from something only he understood. Emma crouched down, her voice calm but firm. This isn't aggression. This is memory. He's not guarding against me. He's guarding against what comes out of that bag. Luke's chest tightened. He saw it now, too, in the way the dog's gaze never left the satchel, in the terror that seemed older than this place, older than their encounter. Emma glanced at Luke. What's his history? Luke hesitated, then admitted he didn't know. All I was told was he's a retired military dog. Nothing else. Paperwork was sealed. Emma exhaled softly. That explains a lot. She kept her distance, lowering herself further to make her body smaller, her tone gentle. He's been conditioned to expect pain when medical equipment shows up. Needles, restraints, maybe worse. Whatever they did to him, it left scars you can't see. Luke clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. He hated how familiar that sounded, the way his own pulse quickened at the sight of a hospital gurney, the sterile smell of antiseptic that pulled him back into field tents and casualty wards. The shepherd growled again, though softer this time, his eyes darting between Emma's bag and Luke standing nearby. Luke took a slow step forward, his voice low. It's okay, buddy. She's not here to hurt you. The dog's gaze flicked to him for a moment, then back to the bag, distrust anchored deep. Emma observed carefully, her expression thoughtful. He listens to you. That's good. But he's not ready for contact. Forcing it will only set him back further. Luke rubbed the back of his neck, frustration leaking into his tone. So what do we do? Just let him starve. He hasn't eaten properly since I brought him home. Emma's eyes softened. Patience. Trauma doesn't care about timetables. You can't rush healing. Right now he needs safety more than he needs exams. She packed the bag slowly, letting the shepherd see every motion, then placed it back in her truck. The growl subsided into heavy breathing, though the dog's body remained tense, ears alert. Luke crouched near the fence, close enough for the shepherd to sense his presence, but not close enough to invade his space. You're safe here, he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the dog or reminding himself. Emma stood beside him quietly. After a long silence, she said, You've got a bond with him already. It's fragile, but it's there. He's mirroring you. He'll follow your lead, whether that's toward healing or deeper into fear. Luke let the words settle. He thought of the way the shepherd had looked at him last night in the storm, the flicker of recognition in his eyes. Broken souls finding each other in the dark. He swallowed hard. Then I can't mess this up, he said. Emma rested a hand on his shoulder. You won't, as long as you remember he's not dangerous. He's just carrying more pain than he knows what to do with. Luke's gaze returned to the shepherd, whose eyes had grown heavy with exhaustion, but whose body still refused to relax. He understood too well. That same battle had kept him awake countless nights, chest heaving, memories too sharp to let go. For a moment he wondered if the dog was saving him as much as he was saving the dog. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning chill, but the weight of what lingered between them did not ease. The Montana sky had been restless all afternoon, gray clouds piling heavy against the horizon, the air carrying that electric stillness that always came before a storm. Luke had been mending the fence along the pasture when the first low rumble of thunder rolled across the fields. He saw the shepherd stiffen near the barn, his ears pinned back, his body pressed low to the ground. Another crack came, sharper this time, and the dog bolted. Luke cursed under his breath, dropping the hammer in his hand as the sky split open. Rain fell hard and sudden, cold needles that soaked his jacket in seconds. He sprinted after the dog, boots sinking into mud, his breath coming ragged. He could barely see through the sheets of water, but the shepherd's dark shape moved like a shadow cutting across the land, heading for the tree line. "Buddy!" Luke shouted, his voice swallowed by thunder. The shepherd didn't slow. He tore through brush and undergrowth, driven by panic so raw it seemed unstoppable. Luke followed the sound of crashing branches until he broke through to the banks of the creek. It had swollen into a raging current, swollen with rain, water smashing against rocks with violent force. The shepherd skidded at the edge, claws scrabbling against the slick mud, before slipping in with a splash that made Luke's heart seize. No! Luke charged forward, mud sucking at his boots as the water carried the dog downstream. The shepherd thrashed, his head bobbing above the surface, his paws striking wildly against the current. Each second he vanished beneath the waves felt like a blow to Luke's chest. He sprinted along the bank, lungs burning, trying to keep pace with the torrent that dragged the dog toward the bend where jagged rocks waited. The urge to dive in clawed at him, but he knew the current would eat him alive too. Instead he stopped, rain pouring over him, and made a choice that went against every instinct to control. He dropped to his knees at the water's edge, mud and rain mixing under him, and shouted over the roar of the storm. "Shadow!" It was the name he'd whispered once in the quiet, the name he hadn't dared use aloud until now. The shepherd's ears flicked, a desperate glance thrown toward the bank. Luke's throat tightened. He didn't reach for the leash strapped across his shoulder, didn't plunge into the current to drag the dog by force. He simply opened his arms, his voice hoarse but steady. "Come to me. You're not alone. Not this time." The water slammed against the shepherd, pulling him under again. Luke leaned forward, his stomach twisting as seconds stretched. Then the dog broke the surface, coughing, paddling against the current. His eyes locked on Luke's through the sheet of rain. For the first time since they had met, the shepherd chose not to run away from him but toward him. His legs churned furiously, his body fighting the torrent with desperate will. Luke crawled closer to the edge, reaching out but careful not to lunge, letting the dog make the decision. At the last moment the shepherd surged forward, claws catching the muddy bank. Luke grabbed him then, not with force but with hands steady, lifting him free of the water's grip. The dog collapsed against him, sides heaving, fur plastered to his body. Luke wrapped his arms around the trembling animal, both of them gasping, rain cascading over their bowed heads. He could feel the dog's heart hammering as hard as his own. For a long moment they stayed like that. Man and dog hunched together at the river's edge, the storm raging around them but unable to break the fragile bond forged in that instant. "You did it," Luke whispered, his voice breaking. "You trusted me." The shepherd shifted, pressing his body closer. Not out of fear, but out of something new. Something that felt like choice. Lightning lit the sky, but this time the dog didn't bolt. His trembling remained, but his eyes stayed fixed on Luke's face, searching, holding. Luke rose slowly, lifting the dog into his arms though his muscles screamed with effort. He carried him up the bank, step by careful step, the mud threatening to pull them both back. When they reached solid ground, Luke sank to his knees again, the shepherd leaning heavily against his chest. The rain continued to fall, soaking them both. But Luke felt something stronger than the storm. The shepherd's head rested briefly against his shoulder, a gesture that was not surrender but trust offered freely, however fragile. In that moment Luke realized the fight was no longer about survival alone. It was about healing, about proving to this broken soul that there was still safety in the world. Still hands that could hold without harm. And maybe, just maybe, it was about proving the same thing to himself. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving the land washed clean but heavy with the smell of wet earth. Luke hadn't slept. He had spent the night on the floor near the dog, who had collapsed from exhaustion after their struggle by the creek. Every now and then the shepherd's body twitched, as though the storm still echoed inside him. Luke reached out once, carefully, and laid a hand on his fur. This time the dog didn't flinch. It was the smallest thread of trust, but it was enough to keep Luke awake until the first light touched the ranch. By mid-morning, Emma's truck appeared on the gravel road again, her tires crunching wet stones. She stepped out with a stack of papers tucked under her arm, her face tight with something between anger and sorrow. "I went digging," she said without preamble, meeting Luke's tired eyes. "And I found more than I expected." Luke motioned her inside, and they sat at the old wooden table in the kitchen. She spread the documents out, pages yellowed at the edges, stamped with official seals that had long since lost their weight. "He wasn't retired military," Emma said quietly. "Not officially. He was transferred to a private security firm 3 years ago. They handle overseas contracts, high-risk jobs, no oversight, no accountability." Luke stared at the name on the page, his jaw clenching. "So they used him like equipment. And when he broke, they tossed him aside." Emma nodded grimly. "And the methods they used look here." She pointed to a section of the training logs. Words jumped out in cold, clinical language. Shock reinforcement. Isolation protocols. Stress conditioning. Luke felt his stomach twist. His mind went to the storm, the way the shepherd had thrown himself against the barn door, the wild panic at the sight of Emma's medical bag. These weren't random behaviors. They were scars carved deep by design. Emma hesitated, then lifted her gaze. "Luke, I think they tried to break him on purpose. Push him past the point of natural instinct. Force obedience through fear. And when he couldn't take it anymore, they labeled him unstable." Luke rose abruptly, pacing the kitchen, his fists tightening at his sides. "I've seen it before. Not with dogs, but with men. Push them until they crack, then call them weak when they can't carry the weight anymore." His voice broke, and he turned away for a moment, fighting the sting in his throat. Emma's silence was steady, giving him space. When he finally sat again, she reached across the table, tapping the edge of the last page. "There's more." His original handler filed a report, tried to raise concerns about the program, but the document was buried, redacted. Someone didn't want this coming out. Luke swallowed hard, his gaze drifting to the shepherd lying near the door. The dog lifted his head slowly, his amber eyes meeting Luke's with a quiet intensity. It was as though he knew they were speaking of him, of the ghosts he carried. Luke's hand shook slightly as he reached down, brushing the fur at the base of the dog's neck. His fingers paused when they caught on something unusual, a ridge of scar tissue hidden beneath the thick coat. He parted the fur gently, and his breath caught. A thin line circled the neck, raw and permanent, the kind of mark that only came from prolonged pressure. Emma leaned closer, her face paling. "That's from an e-collar. Not the standard kind. This was high voltage, used in forced compliance training." Luke pulled his hand back slowly, his stomach turning. They shocked him, over and over, until fear was the only thing left. His voice was low, dangerous, the kind of tone that came from wounds not yet healed. He looked back at the shepherd, who lowered his head onto his paws, eyes still holding that flicker of recognition, of understanding. Luke whispered, more to himself than to Emma. "No wonder he can't stand the sound of doors slamming, or the sight of medical tools. He lived through hell." Emma folded the papers, her expression firm. "This isn't just about saving one dog anymore, Luke. This is about uncovering a system. Someone needs to be held accountable." Luke sat back, his mind racing, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He had thought he was just rescuing an animal from an auction, giving him shelter on a quiet ranch. But now he saw the larger truth. This dog wasn't broken by chance. He was broken by design, by people who had traded compassion for control. The kitchen felt heavy with the revelation. Rain dripped from the eaves outside, steady and relentless, as though echoing the truth that could no longer be ignored. The shepherd shifted closer, resting his body near Luke's chair. It wasn't full trust, not yet, but it was enough to remind Luke that healing wasn't just possible, it was necessary. He reached down again, his hand steadier this time, brushing the dog's fur with care. "They tried to erase you," he murmured. "But you're still here, and as long as you are, I'll make sure they can't hide what they did." The morning after Emma left with the files, Luke tried to bury himself in chores, patching the fence line and hauling bales of hay. But his thoughts circled back again and again to the scar he had felt under the shepherd's fur. Every time he looked at the dog, lying quietly by the porch steps, he imagined the electricity coursing through that collar, the way it must have burned into his skin and his memory. He swore under his breath and drove another nail into the wood, the blow louder than it needed to be. Around midday, the crunch of tires on gravel drew his attention. A black SUV rolled up the drive, gleaming unnaturally clean against the dust and mud of the ranch road. Luke's gut tightened. He set down the hammer, wiping sweat from his forehead as two men stepped out. They wore pressed shirts under jackets too heavy for the weather, their eyes hidden behind sunglasses that didn't belong in rural Montana. The shepherd stiffened immediately, rising to his feet, body angled protectively toward Luke. One of the men smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Walker?" Luke didn't answer right away. He straightened, his stance careful, the wariness of a soldier never far from the surface. "That's me." The man nodded as if confirming something. "We've heard you recently came into possession of a German shepherd. Strong animal, valuable." Luke's jaw flexed. "He's not for sale." The second man chuckled, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket as if to wipe imaginary dust from his sleeve. "Everything's for sale, Mr. Walker. We're prepared to make you a generous offer. Cash. Today." The shepherd growled low, the sound vibrating deep in his chest. Luke glanced at him, then back at the men. His voice was steady but cold. "You wasted a drive. He stays." The smile on the first man's face faded. He exchanged a glance with his partner, then stepped a fraction closer, lowering his voice. "You might not understand the position you're in. Some animals are not meant to live outside controlled environments. They carry liabilities." Luke's shoulders tensed. "Liabilities?" The man's tone sharpened, the polite edge slipping away. "Dogs like yours. Ones that know things. That remember things. Sometimes they're easier to remove than to manage." The shepherd's growl rose, his body pressed close to Luke's leg now, ears pinned, eyes locked on the stranger's. Luke's heart pounded, but his expression remained calm. "You should get back in your car," he said evenly, "before this conversation goes somewhere you don't want it to." The second man laughed again, but this time it was humorless, hard. "You think a soldier and his stray can stand against what's coming? Walk away, Mr. Walker. Take the money while you can. Because if you don't, someone else will come, and they won't be here to negotiate." They let the words hang in the heavy summer air before turning back to their vehicle. The SUV's doors shut with dull thuds, and the tires spat gravel as they drove away, leaving dust hanging like smoke behind them. Luke stood rooted to the ground, fists clenched, watching until the vehicle disappeared over the rise. The shepherd pressed against his side, no longer growling but trembling faintly, as if he too had understood the danger carried in the men's words. Luke crouched down, resting a steadying hand on the dog's shoulder. "They're not taking you," he murmured, his voice thick with something between fury and resolve. "Not now, not ever." The shepherd leaned into his touch, his amber eyes searching Luke's face for assurance. Luke felt the weight of what had just happened settle deep in his chest. This wasn't just about rescuing a broken animal anymore. The world that had scarred this dog wasn't finished with him, and now it had come to Luke's doorstep. Inside the house, the phone sat silent on the counter, Emma's stack of papers still spread across the table. Luke stared at them, at the words that had confirmed the abuse, and realized the men weren't just after a dog, they were after silence. He stepped back onto the porch, the horizon stretched wide before him, and for the first time since bringing the shepherd home, the ranch no longer felt like a sanctuary, it felt like a target. The old pickup rattled to a stop on the gravel drive, its engine coughing before falling silent. The man who climbed out carried himself like someone who had lived underweight for a long time, tall but slightly bent, his limp noticeable with each step. Luke stood firm by the porch, the shepherd tense at his side, fur bristling. The stranger raised both hands where they could see them, his voice low, rough with years. "Easy, I'm not here to hurt anyone." The shepherd growled, but didn't move forward, his amber eyes tracking every motion. The man reached into his jacket slowly, pulled out a worn wallet, and flipped it open. A faded ID showed his face, younger, sharper, beside the words, Department of Defense K-9 handler. Luke's eyes narrowed. Who are you? Jack Turner. Retired handler. I heard whispers about a shepherd showing up at a county auction. Didn't believe it until I saw him myself. His gaze shifted to the dog, lingering there with something almost like grief. I trained dogs like him, and I lost more than I can count to the same company that left those scars on his neck. Luke's stomach clenched. He crouched and parted the fur at the shepherd's throat, running his fingers along the raised line of tissue that circled it. The dog stiffened, but didn't pull away, as if he too understood the moment. Jack's yaw tightened. That's a shock collar scar, not standard issue. That's the kind used when they wanted to break an animal fast, strip it down to obedience and nothing else. Luke's voice came out harsh, edged with anger. You're telling me they did this on purpose? Jack nodded once, his expression grim. I saw it with my own eyes. They called it enhanced training, said it produced reliable dogs, but what it produced was fear, trauma, and too many dead animals. I walked away when I realized what was happening, but not before I lost 3 of my own partners to their methods. He shifted his weight, the limp more pronounced as he moved closer to the porch steps. The shepherd's growl deepened, but Luke rested a calming hand on his shoulder. Jack lowered his voice. I don't blame him for not trusting me. After what he's been through, I'm surprised he trusts anyone at all. Luke stared at him, torn between suspicion and a flicker of recognition. There was something in the man's eyes, the weary understanding of someone who had carried loss in silence too long. 2 men came here a few days ago, Luke said. Finally. Drove up in a black SUV, offered cash. When I refused, they told me some dogs weren't meant to exist out here. Jack's face hardened. That confirms it. They know exactly who he is, and if they know, then they'll keep coming. You're holding the one dog who could expose everything they've been hiding. Luke clenched his fists. Expose how? Nobody listens to stories. They'll just say he's unstable, another broken animal that couldn't be rehabilitated. Jack shook his head. Not with what he carries. The scars on his body, the way he reacts to certain triggers, the records Emma dug up, they all paint a picture. But more than that, he remembers. His behavior isn't random. It's testimony. You just need the right people to see it. Luke sank onto the porch step, elbows on his knees, the weight pressing hard against him. And in the meantime, what happens to us while they try to silence him? Jack didn't soften his words. You'll be targets. They won't hesitate. Not for you. Not for him. But if you walk away, if you hand him over, then every other dog still trapped in that system dies in silence. He's the proof they can't erase. The shepherd pressed closer against Luke's leg, his breathing steady but watchful, as though he understood every word. Luke laid a hand on his back, feeling the steady thrum of his heartbeat. He looked up at Jack, his voice low, but resolute. Then I can't give him up. Jack studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly, respect settling in his eyes. If you mean that, then you need allies. You can't do this alone. I know handlers, vets, even a few lawyers who've tried to fight this fight before. Most of us lost. But with that dog, you've got something we never did. Something undeniable. The air between them was heavy, thick with the truth neither could escape. Luke thought of the creek, of calling the shepherd's name in the storm, and watching him fight his way back through the current. That choice, that leap toward him, had changed everything. The men in the SUV had seen him as liability. Jack saw him as evidence. But Luke saw him as more than either. He was a survivor, a soul who deserved more than cages and pain. The sun slipped behind the horizon, leaving the ranch in long shadows. Jack shifted on his bad leg, his gaze sweeping the empty road. They'll come again, and sooner than you think. You'd better be ready when they do. Luke felt the shepherd press harder against his side, steady and unyielding. His presence both shield and burden. He knew then the fight ahead would not just test their endurance, but decide whether truth would finally break through the silence. The night was quiet in that deceptive way the plains often were, still air pressing against the house, stars sharp above the dark fields. Luke sat at the kitchen table with a lamp glowing low, the stack of Emma's papers and Jack's old contacts spread in front of him. His eyes burned from lack of sleep, but his mind refused to slow. The shepherd lay near the door, chest rising and falling steadily, as though finally at rest. Luke was beginning to think maybe the tension of the past week had eased, when the sound came faint at first, a crunch on gravel that didn't belong. His body froze. The dog's ears twitched, his head snapping up, eyes locked on the door. Another sound followed, softer this time, the unmistakable scrape of metal against wood. Luke's heart hammered as adrenaline surged. He reached instinctively for the rifle propped against the wall, but before he could stand, the shepherd was already on his feet, hackles raised, a deep growl rolling through the room. Luke killed the lamp, plunging the kitchen into darkness, and moved toward the window. Moonlight spilled across the yard, enough to make out the shapes of two men near the porch, their movements sharp and deliberate. One carried something long and thin, likely a crowbar. Luke cursed under his breath. They hadn't come to talk this time. He turned toward the dog, ready to whisper a command. Ready to see him panic and retreat, as he had so many times before. But the shepherd didn't flinch. He planted himself squarely in front of the door, muscles rigid, growl deepening into something primal, the sound of a protector rather than prey. Luke felt his throat tighten. For months he had watched this animal crumble under every trigger, but now, in the face of real danger, something had shifted. The dog wasn't running anymore. The men outside tested the doorknob, then the window pane rattled under the pressure of probing hands. Luke leveled the rifle, voice steady, projecting into the dark. "You picked the wrong house." Silence followed, then a low laugh carried through the night. "We warned you, Walker. Some dogs don't get second chances." The crowbar hit the door with a violent crack. The shepherd lunged forward, teeth bared, snarling with such force the sound rattled Luke's chest. The men hesitated. Luke used the pause. He swung the door open just enough to make his stance clear, rifle aimed squarely at the intruders. "Step away," he growled, "or you'll regret it." One of the men spat onto the porch. "You think you can hide him forever? He's property. You can't change that." Before Luke could respond, the shepherd surged into the gap of the open door, not attacking but standing like a wall of muscle and fury, his body rigid, his snarl unwavering. For the first time, Luke saw him not as a wounded survivor but as what he had always been trained to be: a guardian, a soldier's companion. The men faltered, exchanging a quick glance. The second one muttered, "He's not supposed to be this stable." Luke's finger tightened on the trigger. "You've got 3 seconds to leave my land." They backed down the steps slowly, hands raised, but their eyes burned with the promise of return. The SUV roared to life at the end of the drive, its headlights cutting briefly across the yard before it disappeared into the night. Luke lowered the rifle, but didn't move from the doorway. The shepherd stayed rooted at his side, chest heaving, teeth still bared until the last sound of the engine faded. Only then did he relax, lowering his head slightly, but keeping his body between Luke and the door. Luke crouched beside him, resting a trembling hand against his damp fur. The dog leaned into him, steady and unafraid. Luke's voice came rough, almost breaking. "You stayed. You didn't run." The shepherd blinked slowly, ears twitching, as though the truth needed no answer. For the first time, Luke realized the bond between them had crossed into something deeper. The fear that had once controlled the dog had cracked, replaced by instinct reborn. It wasn't obedience forced through pain, it was loyalty chosen freely. And as Luke looked into those amber eyes glowing faintly in the dark, he knew the fight had only just begun. The dawn after the break-in carried a strange stillness. Luke had not slept at all, and the shepherd, no longer just a frightened survivor, had kept watch by the door, as if guarding against the night returning. When the sun spilled across the fields, Luke stepped outside with him, letting the cold morning air steady his nerves. He crouched, scratching behind the dog's ears. "You deserve a real name," he murmured. The shepherd tilted his head, eyes calm now. "Chance," Luke said at last, the word feeling right in his mouth, "because that's what you never had before. And now, you do." From that moment, chance it was. Later that day, Jack drove up the gravel road, Emma beside him, her truck loaded with files and evidence she had spent nights compiling. Jack looked grim but resolute, a man who had seen too many cover-ups to be surprised by the latest attempt. Emma carried a folder thick with photographs, veterinary records, and even testimony from handlers who had quietly trusted her. Together, they laid everything out on Luke's table. Proof of the abuse, the scars Chance bore, the company's contracts, even details linking the men who had threatened Luke to larger operations across several states. Luke ran a hand over his jaw. We can't hold this in the dark anymore. They'll keep coming until we expose it. Jack nodded, voice low, but steady. Then we go official. FBI, federal investigators, whoever will listen. But you've got to be ready. Once this starts, there's no turning back. Emma placed a hand on Luke's arm. It's not just about Chance. It's about every dog they've broken. If we don't act, nothing changes. Luke glanced at Chance, who lay by the window, ears pricked as if he understood. The decision had already been made in his heart. 2 days later, they drove to the nearest federal office, the weight of their evidence boxed in the truck bed. Chance rode in the back, calm but alert, his presence a living piece of testimony more powerful than paper. Inside, Luke's voice carried the quiet conviction of a man who had lived the cost of silence too long. He laid out the story from the auction to the threats, from the scars on Chance's neck to the night intruders came. Emma supported him with medical facts. Jack added his knowledge of the industry, and together their account painted a picture impossible to ignore. The agents who listened were not just taking notes. They were leaning forward, drawn into the gravity of it. When Luke set down the final photograph, showing Chance's neck marked by the embedded collar scar, the room fell silent. This isn't one dog's story, Luke said. It's dozens. Maybe more. Dogs who gave everything for people who treated them like tools and then discarded them. That ends now. The investigation moved quickly once the first doors opened. Raids across state lines uncovered kennels, where other dogs were held in poor condition. Contracts were seized, bank records traced, and names that had hidden in shadows for years came into the light. News outlets picked up the story, images of Chance standing tall beside Luke circulating widely. To a nation weary of faceless scandals, the sight of a once-broken shepherd now standing proud beside his rescuer struck a chord. Commentators spoke of loyalty betrayed and loyalty reclaimed, and soon petitions surged calling for reform in how working dogs were retired and protected. Within weeks, a congressional hearing was scheduled. Luke never wanted the spotlight, but when he walked into that chamber with Chance at his side, the silence was telling. Senators leaned in as he recounted not just facts but feelings, the weight of seeing the same hollow stare in the dog's eyes that he saw in the mirror after Afghanistan, the way trust had been rebuilt not through force but patience, the night Chance stood between him and danger without hesitation. Chance sat at his heel the entire time, steady as a soldier, and his presence alone silenced doubt. Emma presented the veterinary evidence, Jack the testimonies of handlers. Together, their voices wove into a case that could not be dismissed. In the aftermath, legislation passed requiring independent oversight for all contracted canine programs, mandatory retirement care, and bans on shock-based conditioning. But beyond the legal changes, something deeper took root. A recognition that dogs like Chance were not expendable assets, but partners who bore scars for human wars. For Luke, Emma, Jack, and Chance, the victory was bittersweet. They had forced a reckoning, but so many lives had already been lost. One evening, after the dust settled, Luke stood on his porch watching the horizon bleed into dusk. Chance sat beside him, eyes soft in the fading light. "We did it," Luke whispered, "but it can't end here." With Emma's encouragement and Jack's connections, they began small, an old barn on Luke's property converted into kennels, a fenced field for exercise. Soon, the Second Chance Center opened its doors, taking in retired service dogs, abandoned police canines, and those discarded by private firms. Luke trained them with patience rather than force. Emma tended their medical needs, and Jack guided new handlers who arrived with their own ghosts. Chance became the soul of the place, guiding fearful newcomers with a calm presence. Sometimes Luke would watch him approach a trembling shepherd or a scarred Malinois, lowering his head, waiting patiently until the other dog took that first step toward trust. It was as though Chance knew exactly what they needed, because he had once needed it too. The ranch, once a place of isolation for Luke, filled with life and healing. Veterans visited, families adopted rehabilitated dogs, children laughed in the fields. The wounds of war and abuse did not vanish, but in their place grew something enduring. Hope. On a quiet morning, Luke walked the fence line with Chance at his side, the mountains sharp against the sky. He looked down at the dog who had once been called worthless, and saw instead a partner, a survivor, and the reason he had found purpose again. He bent to rub Chance's neck, the scar no longer just a reminder of pain but a symbol of everything they had overcome. "You saved me, as much as I saved you," Luke said softly. Chance pressed against his leg, steady, unshakable. And for the first time in years, Luke felt whole. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Which moment surprised you most? And what would you have done if you were in Luke's place? Let us know in the comments along with the city you are watching from.